Hi. First of all, I'd like to ask you, if you want to, you can interrupt me and ask questions at any time. And then I'm going to say that I'm actually going to start this talk the way that I normally finish, because what we've heard today is so overwhelming and so, to a certain extent, frustrating, that I want to begin by telling you that it's not just like you've inherited some massive problem. You need to concentrate on the fact that you are actually a part of the solution. And then I'm going to tell you a little bit about my journey. I'm a designer. I am not, well, I've become involved in sustainability, but the entirety of this journey for me starts from a creative need, in particular with a jumper. This was 1997, and I had a jumper with a hole. And I just couldn't be bothered to go and buy those things that you put. So I took my crochet needle and I started to crochet around the hole of the jumper, and then I realized it had a stain, and then there was another hole. So I crocheted around the whole thing. And that remains to me, in a nutshell, the essence of what upcycling is. It's taking something which is at death's door, taking something which is unloved and unwanted, and through your creative process, you bring it back to life. In terms of my story, it went quickly, and I'm not going to bore you too much because there's way more interesting things. But what I would like to remind you is that this was 1997. And in 1997, the word sustainable fashion didn't exist. People didn't upcycle. And being a young creative designer was sustainable enough. And this is a little bit what we've forgotten these days. You know, we've had to put this word, sustainable fashion, ethical fashion. And this is because the industry has completely lost touch with its origin. So much so that it had to go and use another word to describe a practice which is actually very much part of our DNA as designers. So when I started doing From Somewhere, I was part of a group of young UK designers. Some of them went on to become very successful, such as Preen. Others perhaps not quite so successful, but still doing relatively well, such as Ellie Kishimoto. Others have disappeared, sadly, such as Krista Davies. But we were young designers. We were using vintage and abandoned objects, not because we were trying to change the world, but because there was a poetic language, a design language behind reusing, behind rediscovering. And again, this has been really, I think, part of fashion design for a long, long time. We've forgotten it. Over the years, well, within a couple of years, I realized that as much as I could find in terms of secondhand, it didn't really make business sense necessarily just to recuperate what was left unwanted by the consumer. And I became involved in actually sweeping factories' floors for the offcuts that the designers were manufacturing. Now, it was interesting what Nick was saying before. I was operating at the end of the 90s, which is precisely, it coincided with the overproduction of the industry. So while before you would find that perhaps factories had a way of reusing all of their leftovers, by the end of the 90s, we went into hyper-consumption drive, and basically waste became an incredible resource stroke problem. It became way cheaper to actually throw something away and order something new rather than reuse what you had left in your warehouse. So pre-consumer waste was a bit of a novelty at the time. I think we were the first designers that did it. In my case, it happened as I visited a factory in Italy, and I started patching myself pretty much with the way that I'm doing now, grabbing and putting things together, and then I turned it into a technique. It allowed me to reach a much wider market. So At that point, I was working perhaps with, maybe 70 to 75 international stockists. We were quite high-end, so we were selling in the various Henry Bendels and Browns and Colettes of these world. And everything I made was made completely, 100%, out of rubbish. So what's interesting, though, is that I used to go through the factories via the back door and communicate with the warehouse people. Nowadays, of course, I go through the factories by the front door because, of course, I provide a kind of greenification to the factories that give us the waste. But at the time, I was working with the people that really had the waste in their hands, and they understood the power of a tiny scrap of beauty, the importance of things that are left behind, because something, as Sass said, somebody's leftover is a treasure for someone else. And so this is part of the collection that we were doing at the time, again, just putting all sorts of bits and pieces together. And again, creative. We were successful quite quickly. We were on all the main celebrities. I remember at one point Liv Tyler wearing this jumper with a massive hole on her boob, which I never thought was ever going to sell. We were on Nicole Kidman, Madonna, you name them. It was quite big at the time. And so we had a very, very quick start as a label. But again, we were never a sustainable fashion brand. We were just original. What we did was unique. It wasn't part of a life-changing process. It became so for me the more I became aware of quite how much was being left behind, quite how much more this industry was operating in a way that was increasingly more unethical. I remember once arriving in Italy and the main factory that I'd been working with suddenly closed. So over Christmas, this amazing textile factory that was producing for Chanel, for Alberta Ferretti, and many, many others, gone. All the machines had gone to China, which is where they set up their new production. And all the workers were left in Italy without a job. Now, what's interesting is that, as we heard eloquently today, we've moved all of our industry to the developing world. I think in the USA, something like, there's only 20% left in terms of manufacturing. I don't know the statistics of how much is left in Italy. But what did we export? We exported to the developing countries our knowledge, our manufacturing knowledge, partly our skills, but we did not export our ethics. We went there cynically because that was an industry that did not have the same regulation that made producing closer to home way too expensive for this ever-decreasing world of cheaper and more and cheaper and more. I'm not going to bore you with the statistics. I just would like you to think of one. 80 billion garments of clothing leave factories worldwide. 80 billion garments of clothing. But what I want you to think about is not the 80 billion that leave, but all of the stuff that doesn't leave the factories. Because we are talking about probably the equivalent of garments that have a little fault over here. Chuck it away. We are talking about something that might came up with a smaller, shorter sleeve, slashed. There are people employed to slash those clothing for brand protection. And go a little bit further back and start thinking about the manufacturing mills who make the fabric, where millions and millions of meters of fabrics can be discarded simply for being the wrong shade of pink. So when you start thinking about that, you will understand that the waste problem that we have generated is really quite insurmountable. Just briefly, I'm going to go through. These are some of the collections that I worked with. This was one of the very first collections. We did it for Robe di Kappa. This was probably in 2002, I would say. And we used all of their used football, cycling T-shirts, and then we sort of followed that stream all the way to their manufacturers in Italy and used this particular fabric. Sportswear is, I'm slightly obsessed with Speedo because it really does not biodegrade even if you really beg it to. And it's hugely, hugely consumed. Obviously, we buy an enormous amount of sportswear. Very, very difficult to recycle as well. And this is a collection that we did with Tesco Clothing. Now, I always tell the story of this dress because it somehow explains a little bit about how upcycling is a little different in terms of a design technique. I mean, this dress really, really was designed to be pink and orange, but I didn't find any pink and orange, so we had to make it black and white. It was nevertheless a bestseller. Now, when we worked with Tesco, we went to their factories in Sri Lanka. I'm going to show you a photograph a little bit later on. And we realized this dichotomy that effectively when, if they have 30,000 meters of fabric, for them, of course, that's waste because their minimum run of T-shirts is 50,000 T-shirts. So they haven't created the understanding within their design team that you could use those 30,000 meters of fabric perhaps to use the body and only order another 20,000 for the sleeve. So this is what I mean, that upcycling is a design solution to an environmental challenge. And I'm hoping that in the future, the design teams will become more sensitive and more aware of what is left behind by the manufacturing industry at large. This is another iconic piece that we designed, which was for Livia Firth at the Oscars. From Somewhere was the first brand to be on a red carpet at the Oscars. And actually what she's wearing here is mostly La Perla underwear. And this is our collection for Topshop. We did 3 best-selling collections for Topshop, and I'm going to stop a little bit here. I don't know which disciplines you guys come from, but I worked with the design team at Topshop for the last 3.5 years of my life, and I work with 35 of their team each time. And the first collection we tried to do using their factories in Turkey, and again, the complications of upcycling. The design team understands it, they feel it. You go to the factory, you are their enemy. So we arrived at their factory in Turkey, they'd cleaned everything up. Said, we have no waste. No, sorry, we do not produce waste. So I was saying, man, zero waste factory, come on, wake up, it doesn't exist. But what was interesting was that this complete disconnection between the design team, what they want to do, what they believe possible in doing, and the factory behind them. And the reason is that no brand owns their factories anymore. So therefore, again, we have removed all responsibility for the way that we manufacture clothing. Just as you were saying, the brands don't give a damn as to what happens to them once they've made them. They don't really give a damn in how they are made, to the point that with pre-consumer waste and with Topshop, they didn't know, nobody knew who actually owns the fabric. So Topshop thinks that they own the fabric with which their clothes are made. But the manufacturer will tell you a completely different story. They will say, no, we own that factory, because we own the fabric, because we sell you a finished product. And again, when it came to the Topshop collection, when a solution can become part of the design process, we went into the warehouse and there was a piece of fabric that, 10,000 rolls of fabric that had been originally designed to be making leggings, and it had lost elasticity, and that's why it lay unused in a warehouse. And the design team was saying, well, there you go, if it's lost elasticity, it's lost elasticity. There is no way that we can reuse it. It's gone forever. And I just said one word. I said, drape. And that fabric was reused in a different design form. This is a dress that we did for Speedo, using entirely their factory leftovers from their textile mills in Portugal. Again, very, very, very high polluting fabrics, innovative way to reuse it. We did the same with all of their swimsuits. In terms of environmental impact, this particular piece, I wouldn't say that it really counts, but in terms of raising awareness, it actually got speed of 80 million clicks online when they showed it. So again, using this very visual aesthetic as a language. And basically, what I will expand on a little bit later, as in terms of this sustainability and fashion and the aesthetics behind it, is that I know, Nick, what you were saying previously, that we need to create new systems for the future. Sometimes I think that there is a merit in looking back when we move forward. And I will explain this a little bit later on. I've been working with young designers in the UK for years through Aesthetica, which is the sustainable fashion area at London Fashion Week. And I'm going to talk to you in particular about two designers. Now, this is Christopher Rayburn. Christopher Rayburn is nowadays one of the most successful designers in the UK. He is creative director at Victorinox. He is mentored by the same woman who is the brand director at Victoria Beckham. He has very successful menswear collection, women's wear collection. He uses innovative fabrics, produces in Portugal, and although he would never describe himself necessarily as a sustainable designer, everything within his collection is in place in terms of it being a low-impact collection, a no-harm-done approach. Now, this was done with using parachute silks. He will always include elements of upcycling, and to me, he represents the designer of the future, because it's not about focusing necessarily just on one thing. I mean, I leave the 100% upcycle collection to the mad people such as us. But the reality is that a sustainable collection encompasses various different aspects of sustainability. So it is the use of sustainable materials. It is the careful monitoring of who is making your clothes. It is the understanding that you reuse your waste carefully. And Christopher Rayburn, to a certain extent, encompasses for me the understanding that a young designer, if you continue somehow the same way that you started, sustainability will be embedded in your message. When you are a young designer, you cut carefully. Now we call that zero waste. You will reuse fabrics from previous seasons because you can't afford to buy anymore. Now we call that upcycling. You will have your garments sewn from the seamstress round the corner. Now we call that local production. You will tweak your patterns because you won't be able to afford necessarily to have some more. Now we call that classic. And Christopher is somehow encompassing all of this and growing. In many ways, his business model is traditional. On the other hand, we have Katie Jones, who is a young and emerging designer. She's from Central St. Martin. She did the mythical MA with Louise Wilson, who recently died. And Katie has been written about in Vogue. Katie has 6 stockists in the world, okay? And Katie makes almost everything herself. She sells them for an absolute fortune. She has absolutely no lack of interest. And this is her business model. Her business model is, I want to make things at the bottom of my bed with my best friend while I have a cup of tea and a natta. And yet she is successfully supporting her business. So I would like to think also that in terms of sustainability, the new generation is looking at growth in a different way, because it doesn't necessarily mean that we have to grow. I mean, in my case, it has prevented me from getting any bank loan ever. The fact that I will go to the bank manager and say, I'm not actually interested in growing this year. I'm quite happy where I am. Thank you very much. But the reality is that it is a model nevertheless. The only other organism that has a growth for growth mentality is the cancer cell. So, how about this year we don't grow? How about this year we just spend our time knitting at the bottom of our bed and sell in the top best 6 stores in the world that will continue to order and make amazing pieces for people that will have the time and the bother to order and understand that everything is done with love. And this goes back to the who made my clothes. Every piece of clothing that we wear is made by human hands. Now there is a chemical interaction between a hemline, the quality of a hemline, and the quality of the life of the person that is stitching that hemline. So we are wearing people's pains if we don't check who make our clothes every single day of our life. We are wearing their discomfort. We are wearing their exploitation. And this is because we no longer bother to follow the trail as to how our clothes are made. And I want to tell you a little bit about the stigma that has been associated with sustainable fashion. Because if you say sustainable fashion or ethical fashion, people immediately tend to think about very itchy alpaca socks. And this is something that we've been plagued for years in this industry. Oh, sustainable fashion, it's not quite good enough. Well, the first thing is the name is not quite good enough, because if you go to any person that does any kind of branding, what they will tell you is when you start a new business, you give it a good name. Now, ethical fashion, sustainable fashion is really not a good name at all. Secondly, as I explained before, we are fashion, we comply, let the others be unethical fashion or unsustainable fashion, because that's really the way that it should work. Thirdly, when we're talking about upcycling, and we understand that the fashion industry is relatively stupid, because we know that it is, what I want you to think back is, we have this in our aesthetics 100% and always have. The love of the small thing, the being able to value the small object, the recuperating is as part of human nature as human nature. In fact, this is interesting because this is Martin Margiela. And the reason why I have this picture, and I'll go a little bit faster later on, is because Martin Margiela has been, the father of upcycling, has been bought by this guy called Renzo Rosso and his company Only the Brave, who are very much about expansion, very much about growth, very much about mainstream fashion. And yet, what did they call their couture line? And this is one of their pieces, completely 100% upcycled from their couture line. They called it artisanal, which is basically going to show that in terms of aesthetics and in terms of wording, even mainstream fashion is beginning to understand that we somehow need to look back to move forward. We have globalized the world. We've not kept alive any of the traditional artisanal skills. That is as bad as killing the rhino. I mean, artisanal skills are in decline. And this is Kobo fabric in Japan, for instance, which was made with tiny scraps of, and it could have just as been designed by Martin Margiela. And at the same time, we were doing exactly the same thing in terms of quilting, reusing little bits of precious fabrics for the love and the sake of it, and putting them together so that they looked even better. And look, this is mosaic. This is a church in Rome in, 1,500 years old. And that too is for the love of small things and putting them together. And that too is part of an aesthetics. By the way, if you go into any, but nowadays actually even Costa bloody coffee, they're all made with planks of woods, different plates, odd-looking cups. That's an aesthetics. That's an upcycling aesthetics that we are marrying. This is a brilliant designer from the 1920s, Sonia De Lune. And there you go. This is Hermès right now, upcycling their own leftovers for their accessory line. So we're borrowing all the time. And yet, we can now think of this as a solution for the future, even though somehow we've been using it forever in the past. We just have been trained to forget about it. If that's not upcycling, I don't know what else is. But again, the reason why I point at this picture is because, you know, these kids, they did not wake up one morning and think, ooh, ripped t-shirts, ooh, skinny trousers, I'm gonna go to New Look and buy them. No, they didn't. They actually went to their aunt who had a sewing machine, and they said, actually, can I take my trousers in? Can I rip my own t-shirt? Looks were made by people, and now looks are sold by brands in this velocification or quickness of fashion. And this is the high-end copying the guys before, because this is actually a comme des garçons. This is brand new, and it's been made to look like it was old. So do you see what I mean? That everything is kind of working in a circle that doesn't really make any sense anymore. There are many give-back schemes, from the H&M to the M&S shopping. This is the Eileen Fisher, thank you very much. The reality is that we've seen so much about post-consumer waste. We know that it is a relatively unsurmountable problem, although recently I was talking to somebody that works in Africa, and they were saying that they are swamped by our mass consumption. And yet they're beginning to understand that there is almost a new form of craft in transforming these clothes and reselling them in the local market. There is a brilliant company in Ghana who literally, they have the clothes, they sell it in their market stall. At the back, they have 3 machines, they transform them and resell them again at the front of their store. So solutions are being found every single day to innovate. And this is what I was talking to you before. This is the Tesco waste in one of their factories in Sri Lanka. Now this is one aisle of a factory that looks like a football pitch in one of the most humid places on earth. And this is waste. This is one factory in one country, in one piece of the world. And this stuff is likely to remain there for maybe, 2-3 years, until somebody arrives with some big bloody truck and takes it and does we don't really know what, because the factory, once the guy has arrived with a big bloody truck and taken it, it is no longer the company's responsibility what happens to it. Now, again, because I would like you to think, how is a roll of cotton going to behave after 3 years in deep humidity? It's going to rot. It's going to be unusable. And yet, for a company such as Tesco, it's cheaper, it's faster, it's way more convenient to order it new, rather than train a human being to actually go inside this warehouse and do something that we've learned how to do quite a few years ago, which is called counting. So you count that. And you do something else that we do very well these days with computers. You put it all together. I mean, I can't do that, of course, but... So the other thing is that, we're looking at... I don't even want to call it upcycling, because I'm really fed up of all these names that we are giving to something which should really just be called common sense and should also be called innovation. Now, the person that could do that job description doesn't exist. I would like to see a new position, and this new position could be called, a creative waste engineer. And it could be somebody that lives inside this factory and then report back to the Topshop team or the Tesco team or the Chanel team or whoever, because don't believe for a minute that it's only fast fashion that is a problem, because actually the luxury industry produces, and they have so many more issues of logo and brand protection that they incinerate quite a lot as well. But what about this person that puts everything together? How about we start creating a new role? Because in today's world, actually, there is a benefit, because this material, unless you leave it to rot for 3 years, has already been washed. So if you recuperate it, you're not washing again. And we all know that it takes 2,700 and something liters just for one t-shirt. Well, that stuff's already been washed. That stuff's already been tested. That stuff's already got all of the information that any designer, any quality control manager needs to know about that material. It's just lacking that person that counts it. And this has led, well, not all of this, but partly all of this, has led to, Carrie will talk about it a little bit more in detail later on, but in this strange journey that was mine, which went from being inside a studio butchering clothes, and then going to all of the fashion weeks and becoming, you know, the one designer that made it mainstream, and then working for the British Fashion Council. So I've had a lot of full-on fashion, you know, penetration over the years. And it has led me back home. It has led me back to the principal question, which is, who makes my clothes? How are my clothes made? Because this is what we've lost. We've lost the next door neighbor that used to work in a factory. We've lost our Aunt Beth, who used to work in a factory. We've lost the pride of clothes making. And what we have, as I said before, imported is somehow how cynic we are. Because we have imported knowledge, machines, but no ethics and no rules. And above all, we've not really skilled people in being proud of what they do. Because the guy from H&M that says that if we stop buying 64 garment of pieces of clothing and 7 pairs of shoes a year, half of the developing world is going to actually go unemployed and potentially get riots in the streets because, you know, there's not going to be enough. That's crap. Because if actually we were to export the skill of a human person to make one beautiful t-shirt rather than 10 badly made one at speed, if we exported something to do with being slow and being proud, we would have an entirely different workforce and an entirely different approach to fabric. And this is not fashion. And it's actually, whoops, and that's Katie Jones' jumper. I mean, isn't that amazing? And it's actually the Sir Stuart Rose, who was at the time the CEO of Marks and Spencer's, told me, if only we could go back to making one beautiful shirt and not a pack of 3. And it was the CEO of the biggest factory group in Sri Lanka. This guy owns 19 factories, produces for all of the fast fashion brands and some not quite so fast. He said to me, if only I could go to my workers and pay them more to make something of value. Well, that if only is what I'm saying when I say you guys are part of the solution. When you are out into this world, when you will sit in those design teams, when you will be CEOs of company, when you will go and ask for bank loans, when they will tell you, oh, but you know, return of investment, I know that this is the generation that will say, my return of investment has to guarantee that there is quality of life and return of investment for the people that are making my money, for the people that are making my clothes. This is, frankly, a revolution. And it is something that we have to do collectively and jointly. Now, from a fashion perspective, fashion has been revolutionary many times, and I don't have to go back to punk to tell you how influential it can be. But we wear our politics on the clothes that we choose. Clothes are our chosen skin. So just as wearing a slogan t-shirt makes people read your thinking, if you wear designers that you know are working sustainably, again, you are speaking your principles, and you are an influencer for a generation. If you question the brands as to who makes my clothes, you are going to install a dialogue which frankly can change the world. And I am going to leave you with one quote, which is the one that I always use when I'm leaving, and it actually comes from Antoine de Lavoisier, who is the father of modern chemistry. In nature, nothing is created and nothing is destroyed, but everything is transformed. Thank you.